Next is our information item, the strategic and budgetary outlook for 2020-2021 school year. Dr. Dupree.
Yes, sir. It's that time of year where we begin projecting out for the next school year. This year, you're going to see it's a little different type of presentation because we're really being much more dedicated to driving the budget through strategy, which has always been our goal. But now that we've really done a good job of aligning measurable outcomes, we're able to really tie it all together in a much more strategic way. So I'm going to turn the program over to our Deputy, Deanna Saavedra, and our Chief Financial Officer, Brian Gwynn, to kind of lead you through the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree, and good evening, President Burdine and Board of Trustees. As Dr. Dupree indicated, this evening we're going to be sharing all of the work that the staff has done collaboratively to really budget a plan. We're going to begin by just providing you a short overview of the strategic planning process. We'll transition to talk to you specifically about our strategic priorities, and then I'll hand the presentation over to Mr. Brian Gwynn, who will round us out by sharing all of the financial planning that we've done to get us to this point. All of you are familiar with the graph on the screen associated with our strategic framework, and this really has allowed us to, as we discussed at the last board meeting, to align the work in the boardroom all the way to the work that's happening day to day in the classroom. And specifically, we began our strategic planning process in the fall of 2019. In the spring of 2019, the board approved the strategic planning process, or the strategic plan in the spring of 2019. And with that strategic plan are associated we listed a number of milestones that we were trying to hit as a district over the next 5 years. Specifically, we wanted to hit strategic milestones associated with student-centered curriculum, closing gaps with some of our student achievement, professional learning communities, and continuing to build on that practice, moving closer to impact teams, instructional enrichment programs and development of those programs, safe and secure schools, and then collaborative communities. So as I work through the strategic priorities, you're going to see the connections of those priorities to the milestones that are outlined in the strategic plan. So as you look at the screen in front of you and you see that dollar amount, $21.1 million, Mr. Gwynn will be talking to you specifically about how the budget will sustain that dollar amount, but as we work through our strategic priorities, that is the dollar amount that we'll invest to work through those priorities. We're going to begin, I want to share these priorities. First of all, those priorities that have impacted our systems and that will allow us to improve our systems. The first of which is collaborative communities. The district or the board has created specific goals associated with partnering with our community. And so as we work through collaborative communities, we're continuing to build out that department and hire staff so that we can continue the strategic work associated with that. Specifically, we want to begin creating exemplar partnerships in every feeder pattern. In addition to expanding our mentor program, we have a lot of student mentoring going on in our school district. A lot of that is through internal mentors. We want to expand that to include external mentors as well. We've been working over the course of the last 2 years to develop our community-based accountability system. In order to continue that work, we need to continue to invest in that process. And really specifically, as we look at 2021, our investment will be in creating a process and a system that will allow us to signal and report out our accounting. Thirdly, cybersecurity. With Senate Bill 820, the state is now requiring us to adopt a policy and implement systems associated with cybersecurity. So to implement those systems with fidelity, we're going to need to purchase tools and possibly staff so that we can implement that and meet the letter of the law associated with cybersecurity. Next, we want to discuss those programs that are foundational to our students. That means, what do our students need in place in order to secure their success as they matriculate through our system, and what learning opportunities do we want to provide them so that we can enrich their experience while they're in Fort Bend ISD. Specifically, full-day pre-K, Dr. Dupree mentioned that as he was recognizing the board. We are implementing full-day pre-K this year for the first time. We'll continue to expand full-day pre-K. With that expansion, we'll need additional staff, additional instructional resources, and building modifications to ensure that we have classrooms to outfit and that are appropriate for our pre-K students. In addition to that, we've discussed on a number of occasions in the boardroom the desire for dual language. We currently adhere to an early exit bilingual program, which research says is not the optimal program. So we will begin to transition from the early exit to dual language, so our students become biliterate and bicultural and retain their home language while they're transitioning and becoming proficient in English. We will launch dual language in 2021 with pre-K and kinder at all 10 of our bilingual campuses, and it will be a one-way dual language program to begin with. Year over year, we'll begin to increase the cohort as they matriculate through, so it will be a phase-in approach for our dual language programs. Something that's really exciting, our staff has been working for a number of months with the Willow Ridge and Marshall communities to explore a number of different innovative programming options to increase the enrollment at both of those campuses and to provide additional opportunities throughout the feeder pattern for our students. At the high school level, some additional course offerings that will be available to students at both Marshall and Willow Ridge are technical theater, American Sign Language. At Marshall, we discussed in last week's board meeting the piano tech program. We'll also be adding modern band, architecture, engineering, and construction as well. Some enrichment opportunities that will be afforded to our elementary students are we will be continuing our Houston Youth Symphony Coda String project, which will expand to 2 additional elementaries in our Marshall feeder pattern. Micro Society at our elementaries in the Willow Ridge feeder pattern, and then STEM course opportunities across all of our elementary schools. With respect to community engagement, the communities of both the Willow Ridge and Marshall feeder patterns felt like it was important for the PTOs to begin to collaborate across both feeder patterns, again, so that there were discussions about student needs and so that we could make sure that we weren't duplicating efforts across feeder patterns. So that is an initiative to create additional partnerships. As we move on to student programs of choice, we currently have a number of programs of choice that are already in action and have been launched in Fort Bend ISD, specifically our Early Literacy Center. We've seen some great results and great progress at the Early Literacy Center, which we launched a year and a half ago in the Willow Ridge feeder pattern. We're going to continue with that same model and expand that to the Marshall feeder pattern. Again, that'll focus on developing strong literacy and numeracy skills in our highest needs feeder pattern, Willow Ridge and Marshall. We're going to continue with our Early Intervention Academy. We launched that when we launched our Early Literacy Center, and we'll continue to expand that with adding 2 5-year-old classrooms in year 3 of that model, and we'll be relocating that program to a more central campus location, which is something that the parents have requested. And then thirdly, we're going to continue to expand our early college, high school, and P-TECH programs. We launched year 1 this year. It's going very successfully. We will accept a new cohort in year 2 That will require additional staff, additional resources, and some additional technology to prepare students for some of the upper level coursework that they'll begin to engage in. Lastly, we want to think about programs that truly support our students and our staff. Something that we know is that as we continue to work through our instructional goals, if you remember, we created progressions of practice associated with student ownership of learning, with formative assessment, and with developing our PLC protocols, our professional learning community protocols. So as we look at what our staff needs in order to develop the skills to deliver on that, we know that we will need to incorporate planning time for teachers. They've been asking for it for a number of years. Some of the preliminary results of our instructional audit with Gibson also indicate that with additional planning time, we can be much more successful in leveraging the initiatives that we're working on associated with instruction. So with our, at the elementary level, our plan is to create master schedules and provide the staff for teachers to have 90 minutes of planning time per week, where they can come together in a PLC and really develop and plan lessons that support student ownership and the formative assessment that we're looking for. The dollar amount will also serve to assist with increasing fine arts opportunities for students, increasing opportunities for the STEM out class, ensuring that we meet all of the compliance minutes associated with physical education across all of our elementaries, and also improve our library program so that we are much closer to meeting the library standards set forth by the state. For secondary, we're going to continue to, we want to explore the opportunities at the secondary level by piloting at a number of secondary campuses at the high school and the middle school level. We'll also provide staff in critical content areas at the high school level and middle school level to increase the amount of time that teachers have available for them to plan. Lastly, something that is an unfunded mandate that's coming to us from the state via House Bill 3 is the reading academies. What the state is requiring of us associated with the reading academies is that all kinder through third grade teachers and campus leaders be trained in how to explicitly teach reading by the year 2022. They've not provided any funds for us to manage that as a school district, so we will need additional staff to provide not only face-to-face training but also job-embedded training, and then staff to track the hours and all of the administrative pieces associated with the reading academies. Now, this truly is a benefit. We hope to see our teachers become much more skilled in teaching reading, especially in the early literacy years. However, it is a heavy lift for us in terms of our budget. So that really rounds out some of the major priorities that we're looking to fund in the budget. With that, I will take questions, or we can continue with the presentation through the budget process and then take questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Saavedra. We're going to go ahead and make a few comments and questions while we're here. So, Mr. Rosenthal.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Deanna. That was excellent. I think the format of going through these initiatives and then tying it to the budget is really helpful to me. So thank you. I'll touch on this first. You touched on it at the end because you mentioned about the reading academies and how it's an unfunded mandate. When I read through this, whatever it was, 20-page summary, it was 20 pages, 19, I'm sorry. There were several of those, right? That was not the only one, correct? There was that one, I think the cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity, yes, sir.
And was there one other one maybe?
Those two are
Okay.
coming directly from this last legislative session.
Kind of, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
pre-K.
you can- Okay, Okay. They allotted something for it, but it's, yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, so I wanted to just make sure that, you know, people heard that, so. The secondary teacher planning time, I know that things have changed over the years because for a while there was, you know, teachers had like one period and then they had a couple periods and then we kind of went back to one period. Is that correct? Okay, so now we're kind of exploring maybe something in between.
Well, really what we're looking at is what staff do we need to add so that we can create a strategic master schedule that guarantees teachers 90 minutes of planning time at a minimum per week.
Okay, so that's
And
on
that's
top
really
of
what
their.
we're looking at.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay,
Mhm.
so that would be on top of their planning period per day or whatever. Okay,
Mhm.
okay,
Mhm.
great. Okay, and then on the collaborative communities, this is something that we've talked about. One of the things that needs to be in there is when we're dealing with all these community partners, there needs to be accountability associated with that, right? And so I know we've talked about didn't we actually address that recently in one of the policies? So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that piece has to be there so that we know what some of our community partners are actually doing. We know if they're being successful because we're spending money on it. So,
Can I speak to that?
sure.
So I think the board approved that policy, I think, last June. And since that time, Dr. Indelicato has been working. He's hired an executive director. And what they've spent the whole year doing is building out what collaborative communities is going to look like, the procedures, potentially a new policy or so to support it even more. But what you've described is exactly what we're going for, a strong accountability, mutual accountability
Right.
from community to district
Right.
and vice versa.
Right, great,
Yes, sir.
thank you. And then I'm very happy to see some of the new programming, especially my favorite, Micro Society. So that's great. I wish it was also going into the Marshall feeder pattern as well, so hopefully that will expand, okay? So we'll work the kinks out first, see? So I'm thrilled that we're bringing that in, because I mean, I saw that in action in Kingsville, and I just thought that was amazing. It really, I mean, those kids it was hard to believe they were elementary students, it really was. I'm glad to see we're bringing the Coda Strings project into Marshall as well, so that's good. So, thank you again for that summary. It's a perfect tie-in into the budget, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. Tolsan?
Thank you. So I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit because I love that we're offering more opportunities for our students, more choice opportunities that can be geared towards their individual interests. And I especially like that we're doing it at the elementary school level. I will echo that I would love to see the Micro Society expanded. I'm sure we would all love that. I know we have a budget, but that's a very exciting thing, and I would like to see that expanded too. I especially like that we're expanding our fine arts opportunities at the elementary level. I think I said to Mr. Drew this week that I think every single child should have music education of some form, because we all know what all the studies say about cognitive development, and so music needs to touch every student. So I'm really glad that we're expanding that, and I hope that we really monitor that for fidelity to make sure that the kids really are getting that. One of the things I just wanted to kind of maybe put out there is I heard you say something about PE as well, and we've talked a lot in here about making sure that our elementary students are getting enough recess time. And so I know that that's not necessarily it does impact budget, but I just want to make sure that we're not pulling back on that in any way, and just to make sure that our kids at the elementary level are getting that downtime, because we talk about these mental health clinics that we have going in, and frankly, for our elementary kids, that's a mental health break. So we need to make sure that they continue to get that. So I just kind of made a note about that. So you said we were going to pilot the giving secondary, if I heard you correctly, we're going to pilot at the secondary level giving that planning time. Is that at some campuses? I mean, first of all, is that what you said? Did I hear you correctly?
Right. Well, the pilot is really more of a master schedule pilot so that we can look at strategically master scheduling in addition to adding staff in critical content areas to make sure that in areas where we know that our students struggle the most and also areas associated with accountability, that we begin affording the planning time in those areas as we scale up over the next 3 years so that we have it across all secondary campuses.
So in secondary, we're looking at targeting specific content areas. Is that what I'm hearing?
Early on,
Let
with-
me speak to that,
Mhm.
because I'm just gonna tell you, this whole topic is one that's a high priority for me personally, and I know it's important to the board, and it's exceptionally important to our staff, because all the most important outcry I hear from teachers is they need time to execute the work we're asking them to do. So that's the driver behind that big rock you see. Of course, as Deanna mentioned, there's a lot of benefit to, especially at the elementary level, in regard to PE, music, and those things. So we believe it's going to solve a lot of problems, but you can see it's also a major investment. The full investment, just the preliminary calculation to solve the problem at our high schools with a broad brush would be about another $6 or $7 million, if not more.
Okay.
And so budgetarily, we realize we have to do it strategically. We just can't take and put $12 or $13 million into that one thing and address anything else on that list. So I mean, as you're going to hear from Brian, we're going to be prioritizing many of these things, and we may bring more secondary, but the end game truly just, I mean, to cut to the chase, in my view, is we want to get all of our high schools and middle schools to full block scheduling.
Yeah.
We know it's perhaps the most expensive model, but we also know it provides more student choice and more student opportunities. It provides teachers the time they need. It solves a lot of problems and makes the system more robust for all students. But there's a steep price to pay for it. So we're now that we have a good strategic plan, we're trying to make sure we're being very thoughtful about how we would implement any of these things with the mindset that the task I've given staff is to don't come with solutions based on what the budget can bear. Bring the ideal solution, and then we will budget and figure out how to implement it and make the sacrifices and decisions we need to make over time. So that's why we're piloting at the secondary. We know what we need to do, but we also know we need to pilot it and test it and really refine it, and then build the budget over a 2 or 3 year window to get it to full effect.
So thank you for that explanation. And you know, other board members can speak for themselves, but I know this board has talked a while, just like you said, about this being an important thing for us. So I wholeheartedly support that. To me, it's one of the #1 things we need to do for our teachers, because it doesn't just help teachers, it helps students. So I think we've done a good job of trying to build in professional learning opportunities within the school year, and to build in some of those breaks for teachers as well as students. But I agree that this is a high priority. Have we looked into grants or other ways to get something like this funded? I mean, I don't know that there's anything out there, but as we're getting creative, I guess maybe that's a question for Mr. Gwynn, or you know, I mean, is there not some way we can get creative with our funding? Because this is really just that important to try to get this done for our teachers. But I will say thank you for making it a priority. And, you know, I kind of feel like that, you know, redoing how especially high school scheduling is going to help with a lot of our issues that we're seeing, especially as our district grows. I've said that before. This is not new coming from me, but I really feel like it's going to help with choice, and it's going to help with maybe some of that planning time as well. So, you know, the sooner we can make that happen, I think the better for everybody involved. So thanks for working on it. My last question is, okay, you talked about the mandate, which I know is in House Bill 3, the reading academy, so to speak, which just means we need all of our teachers prepared to teach reading. Is it K3? K3. I would just like to ask, I mean, you said this is a heavy lift for us. And it's a little surprising for me, but I'm not in education. It seems to me that a lot of our teachers would be prepared already to do that, because those are the critical years that our kids are learning to read. And the past couple of years, we have come to discover that a lot of our kids and some of our feeder patterns aren't reading, and that's where the crux of our problem. So I guess it raises little alarms for me when I hear that a lot of our teachers aren't prepared already to teach that. So I don't know if that's a question, but I just wanted to put that out there, that it comes as a little bit of a surprise to me that our teachers aren't prepared to do that already.
Well, I would say that our teachers are prepared. The content for the reading academies is going to be specific, and something that's going to come specifically from TEA. In addition to that, it's going to require an additional 10 days of training for every teacher and every leader, elementary campus leader.
In addition to the content.
Time, content, administrative tracking of all of the information. And so I would say that it's going to be a supplement and support for what our teachers already know. But it is going to be very specialized and specific based on the content that we receive from TEA.
How does it relate to our reading academy? Our literacy center? Like is it on the level that those teachers are prepared for and teaching at the moment, or is it different?
It wouldn't be different.
Okay, so, and the reason I asked that is because we wanted to expand the literacy center, and yeah, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe this is going to help us do that. I'm not in the field, so I don't want to speak out of turn, but
it is a good thing. It's
just we have to pay for it. I get it. So I'm not for unfunded mandates, but as we all know, I've advocated for the ones that I think really help kids. So I'm glad we can really help kids. So.
And then it's a short time frame for us to get that many, for districts as large as ours, the amount of time that we have to do it in and sweep all teachers to go through the academy one time and then make sure that all new and incoming teachers go through it. That's the heavy lift that comes with some of that.
And I would add too, I mean, over time, we expect once we get through the initial pass, then it's going to go to fourth and fifth as well.
Yeah.
But the other thing I would add, since you asked about our teachers, we've got, I would say the vast majority of our teachers are well prepared. But, in a district this size, not all the teachers are going to be. But the commissioner, and this is one of those of truly building the plane while we're flying it, because TEA is making up the rules as it's being implemented. So, the commissioner has talked openly about there may be a mechanism for teachers who can kind of pass a test, if you will, to not have to do all the training. Others can do all the training, and it's going to come down to the district being able, we're going to decide what our options are going to be. But no matter what, there's going to be monitoring of outcomes and all of those things. So it's going to be very robust. It's been very carefully designed, and it is going to be carefully mandated by TEA and monitored with what we do. But our goal, by setting up our own training cohort, as you will, because a lot of districts are just going to go buy the service from some of the providers that TEA is putting out there at a per seat cost. But we felt like if we have to do it and we've got to pay for it, we need to make it something that is for our teachers, for our district, based on our mission and vision. So I think it's going to be a good program that's going to align, and really it is going to strengthen us over time. But it's just like Deanna said, the time frame and kind of the force to do it now with your own money kind of thing makes it very challenging.
Well, so thank you for that. While I don't support the unfunded mandates, I do support at least the level of awareness, because this is part of our mission. I mean, this is something we've already done here. So to the extent we can expand the early literacy concepts, at least, I'm 100% on board with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Towson. Mrs. James?
Thank you, Ms. Rodine. So I'd like to echo some of the things that Mrs. Towson was just talking about in terms of the reading academies. It sounds as if there's, basically this is a huge training piece. And so then my mind goes to, well, what is it that we need to know? There's got to be a pre-assessment to know what is it that the teachers need to know, because that's how we focus our money correctly, on the right things. Now, it's all mandated by TEA that everybody does all 10 steps. That doesn't seem very efficient, and I'll be happy to carry that message to Austin when the time comes, because that's an inefficiency in the use of our resources that are very limited. So anyway, that would be my response to that. I also want to echo my colleagues' comments on the innovative programming and the programs of choice that you talked about, Ms. Saavedra, because I really like some of the options that are here and that you guys are proposing. I think that's really exciting. And, you know, as we work, we have these things on our, you know, they come as priorities because they help students get engaged in school, and they give students opportunities during school and after, and when they finish their time with us. And so just keeping that in mind as we're looking at where our priorities are, I think that's really good. And you know, micro-societies, we've been talking about that for I don't know how long, so that's a little bit of plug there. I guess the other thing, when we were, my colleagues were also talking about the planning time. As the board is, and the staff is working towards a model where we're really pushing differentiated learning, that planning time is really, really important. And I recognize that because you know, we've heard it talked about in the SPED with the co-teach model. We've heard it, you know, and I know there's some effort there to align those planning times, and we talked about master scheduling to make that work. But as the students are owning their own learning and there's a whole differentiated environment, then the planning time becomes really, really key, and it's got to be really quality. And 30 minutes at a pop is not enough to get yourself mentally into figuring something out or being creative or any of those things that we want our teachers to do. So I like that concept that you're going to try out, and be interested to see how it goes. So those are my comments on those things. I did have one question. If you could elaborate a little bit about the dual language program, and you said you described it as a one-way program, so if you could explain what that is, and then how it changes from what we have now and what's in policy to what you're proposing. And I assume there's a policy change that goes with that, so I'd like to hear about that too.
Yes, there will be a policy change associated with that, because the current policy that we have in place associated with bilingual programs specifically notes that we adhere to an early exit. So we will need to add language about dual language in addition to, because our early exit will phase out as we bring in cohorts year over year. And so we won't shock the system by eliminating early exit. That would be detrimental to our kids and would really derail their transition from Spanish to English. So we'll phase that program out and launch the dual language program. What dual language one-way means is there's a one-way program and there's two-way. So we're going to initiate with one-way, and that means one-way language acquisition. So our students are all English language learners in the classroom, and they will retain their language while they're transitioning to English, so that by 3rd through 5th grade they've transitioned successfully and can listen, speak, read, write, and think in both languages, rather than leaving their home language and transitioning completely to English, which in many times what happens in an early exit program. So that's the difference between our current bilingual program and the dual language. And one-way means that we'll be servicing all English language learners in the classroom. A two-way
Can I interrupt you just a second just to clarify something? So in the dual language program, they're becoming literate in their home language, and then that helps them to learn and acquire English as in all the aspects that you described. Right. Mm-hmm. So becoming literate in their home language, where presumably that they've heard, you know, ages 0 through 4, when they come to us, then they're first getting illiterate in that language.
Right.
Okay, got it.
Mhm.
Okay, and then the two-way program is the alternative, and that is, can you explain what that is?
So as we can launch our one-way, there will be an opportunity for us to phase in a two-way dual language, and what that allows is for what we call Spanish language learners. So students who are English-speaking students, which would want to acquire Spanish as a second language, would be in the class with English language learners. And so it would be a two-way. So their home language is English, they're transitioning to Spanish, so they become biliterate in both languages, and the other half of the class, their dominant language is Spanish, and they're transitioning to English. So it's a two-way model in the classroom.
And is that something we might consider in the future?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
thank you, that sounds very interesting, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rosenthal?
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. So, because I wasn't sure where that came in, because I went to, was it Tasby or maybe SLI? I think it was SLI last summer. San Marcos, I think it was them. ISD put on a presentation about dual language, and I don't know. I was kind of skeptical, but they were showing how it was really beneficial, and I didn't see any data or anything, but I mean it sounded like it was working well. So thank you for clarifying that. And the other thing is, well, two things. So thank you, Dr. Dupree, for also addressing the reading academies, because what the TEA is asking, it kind of aggravates me, because it doesn't make sense unless they're teaching like new reading or something like that. I mean, I would think that most of our teachers can teach how to read, and maybe there's some new strategies or something, but to force teachers, who most of whom are probably very competent, to go through 10 days of training without funding it, and where's the time? Is that going to extend into the summer? Where are you going to find that time? I mean, that's absurd, and I find it funny that they already have vendors lined up to train people. So, I mean, that kind of tells you something too, you know? Not to be skeptical or anything, but
If I might, and Deanna, I'm probably stepping way out of line, but so tell me, you can correct me, and publicly if you need to. As I understand it, I think the impetus behind the decision, and we see this in our own district. You've got generations of teachers who taught heavily using phonics. And then you've got generations of teachers that taught heavily using whole language and not phonics. What the state is trying to drive us to is using both components. Both are critical. And so that would be the benefit for our district, is bringing everyone into alignment, so everyone has mastered, the goal would be everyone has mastered both aspects, because both are important, is what we really see. We've moved toward that model
Right.
in our district, but with so many teachers, we've not been able to get all of them through the training and where they need to be, with even our expectation of bringing both elements to the table.
Mhm. Balanced
And
literacy.
that's the balanced literacy, and you hear us refer to that, but that's what TEA is trying to do. So we're ahead of it. We've been on there. We've been doing it for a while,
3
but
years.
it truly is, it is education. We have all seen the flip from whole language to phonics, back and forth multiple times.
Mhm.
And what we're trying to realize, it takes both. And so it's just getting all the teachers up to a common language and a common practice.
Mhm.
okay.
Is
Sounds
that what
good.
is that what the data shows? The data shows that it takes both.
Well, we as a school district, our instructional model adheres to the balanced literacy framework. And so we've been, as Dr. Dupree indicated, for the last 3 years, we've been engaged with the Teaching and Learning Alliance, that's who we use at the Early Literacy Center to train our teachers in the balanced literacy framework. But at other elementaries, we have our balanced literacy cadres where we're working with, through that balanced literacy model. So it will allow us to develop, as Dr. Dupree said, a common language, really associated with balanced literacy, and get everyone on the same page. So.
Thank you, Dr. Saavedra. I'd like to thank my fellow board members for their questions and comments. There's a whole lot here, and I think this has been a great presentation. Not to go over everything that's just been said, but we've got a lot of wins here, and I think this is a great example of Fort Bend ISD taking it to the next level. So let us know how we can support you, and thank you very much for all your hard work and the presentation that was given, and all that we're doing as a district. Moving right along, let's go ahead and move to the
Well,
budget.
I'm going to hand it over to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Let's go to the budget part of our presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
And as we've prepared the budget this year, we've done it based on the staffing allocations that are needed to currently support our existing student population and the strategic priorities that Deanna just walked through with you. So as I show you the budget information shortly, you'll see those numbers incorporated into the planning work that we're doing for the 2021 school year. I want to begin by saying that House Bill 3 had a tremendous impact on school finance. And as we put together the budget, we're looking at everything that we do through the lens of how did House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 2 impact us overall. The items that are indicated up here, what I'll point out is the cost of education index on the first item that was repealed. You all are aware that we talked at length about that during the last budget cycle, indicating that that was worth about $56 million to us. Unfortunately, with the changes that were made by House Bill 3, that provision was eliminated, and the changes that they made to the various funding weights did not make us whole. So that is something that is of particular concern for us, but I'll talk to you in a moment how that's been mitigated. On the adjusted column, the particular areas that I'll focus on are the basic allotment and the Tier 1 tax rate and the guaranteed yields in Tier 2. When we put together the budget, we made sure that we incorporated those changes into what we were doing. So the numbers that I show you this evening are indicative of the changes associated with that. And then finally, under the new items, you all are aware that we have the transition grant, the next to last item on there. Because our district did not receive at least a 3% increase over the old formula, we did qualify for that transition grant. That's worth about $18 million a year for us, and we've included that in there. Now, unfortunately, that does expire after the 24-25 school year, so there are some concerns about the long-term sustainability, but I will indicate that we do have at least 2 legislative sessions between now and then, 1 to prepare for that fiscally, and 2 to also lobby in Austin to make sure that they are, let me rephrase that, to advocate in Austin for changes to that to ensure that the level of funding that we have to sustain the programs that we're implementing is sustainable over the long term. And then as Deanna mentioned, we have the full day pre-K program that was implemented this year that's currently in process. That does continue into the upcoming school year. The thing that I'll mention is that we're using the early education allotment, which is new as part of House Bill 3. And what I would say is that that is for early readers, if you will, but that assumes that you want to spend all of that money 100% on a pre-K program. Not advocating that we would change anything associated with that, but if we have other reading priorities that need to be addressed, we've utilized 100% of that funding on our pre-K program. So I do want to point out that that is how we're funding that, and it does not leave a lot of room for the early education allotment beyond that. Some of the other critical factors that influence the budget in addition to House Bill 3 and Senate Bill 2 would be enrollment growth, property values, and the tax rate, and we'll be discussing each of those as we go through the presentation. The first item is we have received our enrollment growth from the demographer. You'll be hearing from them at the February board meeting, but it is indicating that we have about 79,000 students that we'll be serving in the upcoming year. That's about a 1,300 student growth. Again, we're using the moderate projection as we typically do during the year. So that is expected in the upcoming year over our PEIMS and a snapshot from October of this year. As we've seen in the past, our special education enrollment continues to grow. We're expecting about 11% of our student population to be identified as special education in the upcoming school year. That is an increase of just about 1% over the current year. What I'll say in relation to that, you may recall that the national average for special education students as a percentage of the population is about 13%. So we're expecting, at least for next year and the year after, to see some continued identification as we go through that process. The reason I bring this up is as we put together the budget, we do take into account the additional resources needed to serve those students with those special needs. So the numbers that I show you will incorporate that information as well. For property value growth, we're expecting a 5% increase over the prior year. That will bring our valuation to about $43.3 billion. That does not include the over 65 and disabled person exemption. So when we do more detailed presentations on property value growth as we progress forward, we'll share that information with you. And then just as a reminder on that 5% growth, there have been few years where we have seen below 5%. We feel this is a conservative number. And what I will say is we are actively working. We've been in contact with the chief appraiser to schedule a meeting with him to discuss our initial outlook to make sure it's in alignment with him so that we don't have to come back later in the year and say we got that number wrong. But at least for initial planning purposes, that's our starting point, and we'll be having those further conversations with the Central Appraisal District in the month of February. For Senate Bill 2, this is probably one of the areas that keeps me up at night. This is the specific bill that caps our valuation growth at 2.5% on the O&M side. So I do want to point out this does not affect the debt service rate, but it does impact our O&M side. And this will be effective for the 2021 tax bill year, so this is going to impact us next year. So the way that the law is currently written, the state will make up that lost revenue. However, they did not fund it with ongoing funds, and they basically left that to decide in the next legislative session. There was talk of an increase on the sales tax rate, but ultimately they did not come up with a funding source that will make this sustainable over the long term. What I'll say is that this is also turning over the responsibility for calculating the valuation of our property value to TEA, which is something that they have never done before. This has typically been done through the Texas Controller, and they did that through a special tax division, the CPTD, as we have often referred to that. So what we're expecting is that our tax rate adoption will likely be pushed back to late September. I would like to provide more information to you, but at this point, TEA still has not released the mechanism by which this will actually be done and calculated. So we're doing everything through the lens of what we know today. We'll be receiving additional clarification as the year progresses, but at this point, there's still a lot of uncertainty around the full impact of this. The only thing that we can say with absolute certainty is when the current biennium, they have funded the additional growth over 2.5% that the state would pick up. So we're reasonably sure that we'll receive that additional revenue based on their funding formula. On the other side, we have House Bill 3. And what I'll say there is that you all recall that when we adopted the tax rate this year, it did include a 7-cent compression of the tax rate. So we went down from $1.06 to 99 cents. As we look forward in our modeling, we are taking that into consideration. It also changed the golden pennies, which are actually 1.6% of the basic allotment. So the golden pennies are now worth $96.48. They've also increased the number of golden pennies from 6 to 8. And as you're aware, we currently have 6 of those golden pennies. There are 2 that are available to us. I'll touch on that in just a moment. And then on the Tier 2 side, the copper penny yield was decoupled from the Austin yield. It's now based on, and that's the same for the golden penny as well. They're now based on off of the basic allotment, and the copper penny is set to 0.8%, not says 80%, it's actually 0.8% of the basic allotment. So that has changed the value there. Again, the golden pennies are not recapturable. However, the copper pennies remain recapturable. The final item that I'll point out on here is that they recreated Chapter 41. This was a Robin Hood provision, and that is no longer Chapter 41. It's now Chapter 48 and 49 of the Education Code. When they did that, you all recall in the past we had the board take action on our property wealth because we were a Chapter 41 district. We had just not reached the point of actually having to pay in. With the way that they've recalculated things, we are no longer a Chapter, what would be 48 district. So at this point, there's no danger of us having to pay in at this point, and that's not expected for several years. Again, the calculations haven't been fully released, so we don't know at what specific point we may hit that threshold, but we are no longer in danger of having to pay out to the state. And then as I mentioned a moment ago, the state switched to current year property values as opposed to the CPTD, so that will be interesting, although this impacts everyone. The negative impact of that was accounted for, I believe, in this current year, so we will not see really any detriment to our planning purposes in the budget for that. I'd like to walk you through now the 1920 budget assumptions and how we expect to end this year. Our projected enrollment did come in actually higher than what we were expecting. We used the moderate growth, and we came in at about 500 students more than what we were projecting over the moderate growth. Our average daily attendance is up slightly, and our property value growth came in at about 0.5% higher than what we were expecting. And then our free and reduced count also was up. So long story short there, when we're looking at our revenues for the upcoming year, we are seeing an increase based on those factors that I'll walk you through in just a moment. So we were asked earlier in the year or late last year whether or not we would end this current fiscal year in the black, and we hedged a little bit and said we'll have better information for you in January. And I am pleased to report, based on what we are seeing, we are expecting to end the year with a surplus of about $3 million. That takes into account those revenue offsets that I just said. The good news is there, you may recall that we set aside $10 million in economic stabilization funding. We will not have to use that money and be able to carry that forward into the upcoming fiscal year based on what we're seeing. And I've been asked for the Latin lesson. I've been a little bit remiss in that, and this is what I like to say, ceteris paribus. So basically, all things staying equal, we will see that revenue in the upcoming year or things ending. What does that mean for our bottom line? When we projected the budget into the adopted budget was assuming we would have 100 days in fund balance. We're expecting to have 106 days in our fund balance, which is above our policy requirement of 90 days. So overall, we are expecting things to look much better at year end. I will point out that that 100-day operating reserve and the 106 days includes the $21 million that we received as part of the Harvey Hold Harmless. So that's part of the reason that that fund balance looks so positive, is we received that at the end of last year, and it was booked in the prior fiscal year, but is benefiting us in how things look this year. Briefly on the revenues, part of the reason that we are seeing some of those increases is the changes to the state funding formula. That's worth about $4.5 million. We're seeing some other minor adjustments in there, but the biggest one is the state funding formulas. At the end of the day, $8 million of that is associated with those changes. You saw maybe in the prior slide that we're seeing about a $17.6 million increase in revenues. $9.6 million of that is TRS on behalf when we true that number up. So that's really an in and out number that we don't directly benefit from. These are specifically numbers that we'll benefit from in the upcoming year or in this current year. On the expenditure side, our expenditures are expected to increase by about $4.7 million net. About $4.2 million of that are the encumbrance rollovers that the board approved in October. And then there are some additional budget adjustments that we're expecting for curriculum writing. That's worth about $500,000 for that project to continue. So as we roll into the 2021 year, the guiding philosophy that we use to put together the budget is to advance the district goals and objectives. That was the strategic items that Deanna just overviewed with you. The other is to utilize fund balance capacity while we maintain our 90-day reserve. And then, as I mentioned, there is now an optional golden penny. We are recommending to the board that the board take advantage of that additional golden penny. Essentially, in order to take advantage of that, it has to be approved by unanimous vote of the board to enact that golden penny. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment and show you what the impact is. And then the final item is that we were looking to try to put off, to the extent that we can, a tax ratification election. And based on the plan that I'll show you tonight, we do have the capacity to at least put that off for one more year without having to ask the voters to increase the tax rate specific to the additional 11 cents that we have available. Looking at our budget assumptions for the upcoming year, as I mentioned, we're expecting enrollment growth right at 80,000. The other big item to point out there, as I mentioned, the property value growth of 5%, and this is one of those areas that I do want to point out, again, ceteris paribus, if things look as they have in the past, each 1% swing, either up or down in the property value, is about $4.8 million. So if you recall, last year we projected 5%. We came in at 5.47%. That additional 0.5% was worth a little over $2 million. So again, the numbers that we're showing you when we look at the sensitivity analysis, even though 1% is very small, it has a tremendous impact on our budget overall as we do our planning purposes. And then we are looking at some additional growth in our free and reduced, so I won't walk through each of those individually, but these are the specific assumptions that we're looking at as we put together the budget. So how does the forecast look? We haven't looked out beyond 2021 at this point. We're not quite at that point yet, but when we look at 2021, I'll go straight to the bottom line and then walk you through things. Our initial look with the items that Deanna reviewed with you, we're at an 89-day fund balance policy requirement, so we do still have some work that we need to do in order to shore up those numbers and find out specifically what's the first priority that we want to fund in terms of everything. But overall, you'll notice on there, we're expecting about $742 million in revenue. That's an increase of of about $20 million over our current revenue. When we look at that, this does include the additional revenue from that golden penny that is optional, that again, that the board can approve with a unanimous vote. That's worth just under $6 million. So it's an ongoing revenue source. We do recommend that as part of the upcoming budget. As we move to the expenditure side, you'll notice that it's about $740 million. That growth from 721 to 740 million is accounting for the additional growth in the special education population and overall student population growth. So this doesn't include any of the new initiatives. Below that, you'll see the strategic initiatives that we're looking at, the $21 million, and that's folded into the overall number of $760 million. So that's, at this point, the budget that we would be looking at in the upcoming fiscal year. The fund balance is $241 million to start with. We would be recommending the use of economic stabilization as we did last year. So we're carrying forward $10 million. We would be asking the board to authorize us to use up to $15 million or almost $16 million to ultimately balance the budget from that. Leaving us with, again, currently we're at 24% or 89 days. We'll be doing work over the next coming weeks and months to basically balance that to 90 days to ensure that when the board ultimately adopts the budget, we meet our policy 90-day fund balance requirement. And to close things out, we do have some known unknowns, the biggest one being the long-term sustainability of the state funding. That, again, continues to keep me up at night. The transition grant is included in that funding formula that I just showed you. That expires in 2025. We want to make sure any decisions that we make are sustainable in the long term. And then finally, the Commissioner of Education has not made a determination on how the Tier 1 calculations are going to occur yet. We're waiting on that. So again, keeping us up at night. And then the tax rate has not been, this is all unknown unknowns. We're hoping to have better clarification from that. They do release videos on an ongoing basis. This is one that we're waiting on to receive final words on that. And finally, the actions that we'll see over the coming weeks and months where we'll be asking the board to take action. In February, we intend to bring to you the staffing that will support enrollment growth and potentially some of the new priority items. Moving into March, again, we'll be looking at board to take action on some of the strategic priorities as well as potential compensation adjustments. I will mention that the information that we showed you previously does not include a general pay increase, although we are continuing to look at that, and we'll be making final recommendations, and ultimately the budget that we present will either take that into account or look at alternative ways potentially of compensating employees like we've done in the past with the retention supplements. And then April would be when we receive our preliminary tax roll for the tax year 2020. And then that's also a point at which some of the policy considerations that may be needed as part of the strategic initiatives that we have, where we would be potentially asking the board to take action. May would be when we do our publications and the call of the meeting. And then finally, June would be when we ultimately ask the board to adopt the budget. And then I'm going to, unfortunately, as all this occurs, we receive the certified roll in July, which will tell us what everything ultimately will look like with a tax rate adoption if everything goes according to plan in September, and assuming TEA is staffed and ready to manage that process. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Thank you, Mr. Gwynn. We appreciate the presentation. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. And Mr. Gwynn, I'd like to give a shout out to you for the excellent presentation you made last Friday at the Fort Bend Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
A lot of this material was covered then, and I think every time we make a presentation like that, it helps to inform the community at large, and I'm my hope is that people will go home and having learned something from your presentation and inform their friends and neighbors, so they'll be encouraged to continue to support our school district. I'm looking at slide 19, and I think I heard you say each percentage point that of increased property growth, property tax growth, was that worth, how much was that worth? 5 million?
Right at 5 million,
Right at 5
4.8
million.
million.
But although in the last, let's see, 13 years, and if we want to go back longer, we could, our property tax growth has not fallen at 2.5% or below except for 4 times. So in 4 years out of 13, our property tax growth has been above 2.5%. So if we have the 5% growth this year, am I to understand that we will only be able to realize 2.5% of that growth?
Well, the way that the state is doing it is currently, as again, what I would say is they have funded it for the current biennium, is any growth above the 2.5%, the state will basically make us whole for the remaining portion of that. And how that's going to look beyond the current funding year, we don't know yet. But at this point, that is funded, but they are capping our growth, our internal revenue growth at the local level at 2.5%. We will not be able to exceed on the local side 2.5% growth
Okay, so for this biennium,
for this biennium.
and when the 87th meets next year, this time next year, that might change.
Well, I would not expect the 2.5% cap to change. What I would potentially expect to happen is they either, one, come up with a funding source that makes sure that they can sustain that growth, that local property value grows over the long term, or two, do it as they did this year, and that is punt the can down the road for an additional 2-year period.
Okay, so for this budget planning session, we're okay.
That is correct, sir.
And I wanted to ask you another thing, and that is, in the past, so right about now, you are visiting with the chief CAD appraisal district to find out what they project today in January. It's an iterative process, which they'll finalize that in April. Is that what I heard you say?
They will finalize it actually in July. April is the point at which all of the protests tend to come in and be resolved. But by July,
Okay.
we will have finality
Okay.
to that list.
So, but as we go forward with our budget planning, it's this iterative process where we're trying to fund all of our strategic initiatives, but we're also balancing that against what we forecast our revenue is going to be.
That is correct.
And then in the past, I believe that the comptroller, Glenn Hagar's division, his comptroller's property tax division would finally certify this year's tax rolls 1 year in arrears.
Correct.
It'd be next year. So, and then if it went up or down, then we get dinged at that time.
Correct.
And now the TEA, so the 86th legislative session ended at the end of May last year, so 8 months ago, less than a year. They're going to take over this role, which they've never done before. And I don't know if they're going to hire all the appraisers who used to work for the comptroller and move them over there. I really don't know what's going to happen, and that's why you're nervous.
That is, the way that they will manage that has not been communicated, and that creates some anxiety on our level because we don't have certainty on what that process will look like.
And because of this uncertainty, we'll be adopting our budget. We'll be voting on our budget in June, and we will then find out what the tax rate's really gonna have to be in September.
That is unfortunately the reality that we now live in based on the 86th legislative session. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your efforts and also your predecessor, Mr. Steve Bassett, because I know he was one of the few chief financial officers, along with is it Mr. Smith from
Chris Smith.
Katy ISD? Who is it from Katy?
Mr. Chris Smith, yes, sir.
Who went to Austin and met with Rick Miller and others to tell them, because of our situation, we were going to come out on the short end of the stick, and I think that led to, as I understand it, this transition grant,
Mhm.
which is helping us through for the next, is it 4 years?
We will have 4 years remaining at the end of this school year. It was 5 years total, so 2025 will be the last year of that grant.
2025, okay. So we're at $43 billion in appraised value within our political subdivision. That's a record. Let's see, tax rated up. I think, I am glad to know that we have maintained our own economic stabilization fund or rainy day fund, and we should all be gratified that we have been prudent in our expenditures, and we still have some of that money that we can carry forward into next year to help fund our strategic initiative. And I really think this alignment of our strategic goals, that should drive the budget, because as with any organization, you have to ask yourself, what are we trying to achieve, and how are we going to spend the money to achieve that? And so I think this is really the best that we've been at, and I'm proud to be a part of that with y'all. So I think you're doing a great job, Mr. Gwynn, and but I need to borrow your Latin book when you're not busy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. You said it that very well, and I echo everything that you just said. I have two comments. Mr. Rice touched on this, and we don't need to beat this up, but I'm really concerned about the new powers of the TEA. I can't get over that. And I don't have anything else to say about it, but that's really concerning. But as you stated, that's our new reality. And then when can we vote for the golden penny? Does that need to be in the fall, or can we do that sooner? What does that look like?
That is correct. So the budget that you adopt would assuming that the board approves the budget as we've currently presented it, making it balanced, would assume that we have the additional golden penny. And then at the point that the tax rate is adopted, if you adopt the tax rate as presented with the additional golden penny, again, it does have to be a unanimous vote in order to take advantage of that. It would be included in the tax rate calculation as part of that vote.
Okay.
Now, as I say that, I do want to point out that TEA has not officially released the guidance on it. That's our initial understanding of how that process will work.
So that's still an unknown.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate you and your department and all your hard work. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenthal had a comment or a question real quick.
So just to clarify, so if we did that, then our rate would go up from 99 cents to $1, the M&O rate.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We will now convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act, Chapter 551, in those sections listed in the agenda, for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney on any or all subject matters authorized by law. We are now convened in closed session.